Against the Affordable Care Act has allowed many.
It's like a bunch of
Very. I was hands on to find a good job, and a lot of people do quite good jobs.
No, it's funny.
In the Affordable Care Act, for so long, but used to.
Never saw a settled policy or someone trying to get rid of it.
There's always one.
I see it in the sun and the other.
What ideas? What's
Well, there's a concept of it.
I was hoping you would. The concept of it.
My name is Joshua Rucknick. I'm from Rapid City, South Dakota, and it's great to be sharing this space with you this evening. It's my pleasure to welcome you tonight to this state's premier literary event, the South Dakota Festival of Books. We would like to acknowledge first and foremost, that we stand on ground of the Ocheti Shakoi, the Lakota, Dakota, and Nakota people. We honor and appreciate the indigenous people who have the longest relationship to this place. Before we begin tonight's event, a great thank you to the Oscar Larson Performing Arts Center for hosting so many of our festival events. Thank you also to the many volunteers who assist in our planning and staffing. You too can help the festival. First, you can provide us with feedback about this year's event. The link to our online survey is available at sdbookfestival.com. Second, you can help keep the festival free by making a tax deductible donation to the South Dakota Humanities Council. To donate, visit sdhumanities.org or use the slips available at the SDHC information booth. With your gift, you can enter our drawing for a print of our festival guide cover image by Brookings artist Chuck Bennis. Donate $50 for your first entry, or $50 for your first entry, and $10 for each entry after that. This festival would also not be possible without the generous support of the numerous organizations and individuals who have already donated and are acknowledged on the back cover of the festival guide. If you are a sponsor of the South Dakota Humanities Council and the Festival of Books, I ask that you please stand and be recognized. If you have any questions for Peter Heller, we ask that you come to one of the standing microphones in the aisles when he is ready for Q&A. Finally, I want to mention that Peter's books are available for purchase in the lobby, and he will be glad to sign them for you after the presentation. Tonight's program is titled Rivers, Mountains, and the Alchemy of Storytelling. Peter Heller is the national bestseller author of 11 books, 4 nonfiction and 7 fiction, including 2023's The Last Ranger and 2024's Burn. His novel, The Painter, won the prestigious Reading the West Book Award. An award-winning adventure writer and a longtime contributor to NPR, Heller is a contributing editor at Outside Magazine, Men's Journal, and the National Geographic Adventure. He holds an MFA from the Iowa Writers Workshop in Poetry and Fiction. Please welcome Peter Heller. Thank you.
Thank you, Joshua, and thank you, Jennifer Widman and Carolyn Speakman, for reaching out. Again, it's great to be here again. Huge honor. And thanks to the Book Festival for having me and all the people who made this possible. You guys have 65 authors? It's amazing. What if the Russians did a nuclear strike on Brookings right now? We'd lose our literary culture. I thought maybe tonight that I would read to you for a few minutes. Is that all right? My dad used to read to me when I was little, every night almost. And he was reading E. E. Cummings to me when I was like 6, which is sort of grounds for social services. Because hold on one second. This thing dropped. They're kind of bawdy. I didn't understand them, thank goodness. But I still remember Buffalo Bill's defunct, who used to ride a silver water smooth stallion and break 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pigeons just like that. Jesus, he was a handsome man. And what I want to know is, how do you like your blue-eyed boy, Mr. Death? I'm like 6, I was like, it was a little rugged, but I love the sound of the language. And he read Yeats to me when I was 11. I remember Prayer for My Daughter. I have walked and prayed for this young child an hour, and heard the sea wind scream upon the tower and under the arches of the bridge, and scream in the elms above the flooded stream. So beautiful. And I like to invoke those before a reading because they're a couple of my favorites, and it reminds me of what I'm doing here. What we're doing here is to kind of try and touch that power of language that I love since I was little. So I think the other reason to hear an author read fiction aloud is that I'm a very aural writer, Aural. I kind of hear the lines before I write them. And if I read to you for a few minutes, then you can sort of hear the voice that I heard. So I'm going to read from Burn, which just came out a month ago because I'm excited about it. And I'll start. I'm just going to read a few minutes of the prologue and save you a little time if you want to read the book. So, Burn, prologue. He let the fire burn down to embers, let the dark envelop him, and stood. Jess stepped to the edge of the trees and looked down to the water. It was a big lake, and he could see only the bay and the curve of the wooded shore, and he could see that the water held there was nearly glass. The black mirror floated countless stars, and the stars barely rocked. He lifted his eyes to where they held fast in the depthless sky, and he saw among them a satellite sailing swiftly east to west, and he wondered what it might be witnessing in its silent transit. If he himself could be a night bird like some great horned owl on soundless wings, would he fly north over the next town, over the road beyond it? Probably not. Would he want to see? No. In the days since they had found the bridge over the river blown and no way south, he had dreamt hard every night, dreams on dreams with segues like swinging bridges. He had dreamed of their house, his house now, but it stood in the sage of some high western desert, unprotected by a single tree. And the rail fences were broken, the horses vanished. In the dream, they had more than one horse, but he couldn't remember how many or if he'd asked a neighbor to take care of them while he was gone, because he was gone. That was the gut weight of the dream. He dreamed the return again and again, a homecoming only as much as an old negative represented the photographed image, a homecoming that was as much a leaving, and she was never in it. He called for her inside a house he no longer recognized, and again in successive nights, he walked around the house to the back, to the clothesline stanchions that gestured like empty crosses, and he found a well, and he called for her there, and dared to look down it, and received only cold echo. He woke from that dream with the pillow of his rolled jacket wet. He lay in the wash of his own story and let the sound of a faint, broken music trail off, and he let himself cry. And almost as soon as he gave himself permission to sleep, he was pulled back into the dark. There was no swimming above it. He dreamt then that he was in a pasture digging, first with a spade, which he laid down so he could scoop back the finely graveled mud with bare hands, the ditch some kind of drain, and when he stood, he saw a former lover walking past the white clapboard house, her glance back seductive the way any vista is seductive, just passing out of view. But he didn't know her. He should, but he didn't. She had large dark eyes, as Jan had, and his longing was for something familiar, some beauty that rolled in his raw fingers as the prayer stone she had given him rolled now, while he stood with the trees at his back. She called it a prayer stone. It was the size of a radish and taken from their favorite creek and given to him as a reminder to pay attention. Love is attention, she'd said. That is all you know on earth. He had it in his pocket now, and as he stood at the edge of the woods and watched the drifting stars jostle barely on the water like faint semaphores, and smelled the cold sediment of the lake and the cold char of the town, he squeezed the stone in his right palm and wished he could signal her as the sparked reflections on the water seemed to blink to the throned galaxies arching above. I am here, forever rhyming, forever loyal. Or maybe it was just an unheard music that time and space could never quiet. A music that turned and turned like a horse in the wheeling dark. And with that thought and the warming stone chafing his palm, he thrummed with a grief and love so immense he could not contain it. To stand here, to breathe, to witness. He thought wildly in that moment, they better be enough. So, oh, thank you. Appreciate it. I'm going to take the jacket off if that's okay. Put it on for respect, but for coolness, we'll take it off. So I thought it'd be fun to tell you kind of how I got to writing this novel. I finished it about a year ago, and so my dad read to me, as I said, when I was a little tiny kid. And then when I was 11, I was walking around my little library in my little school in Brooklyn Heights, where I grew up in New York City. And I had a crush on the librarian. I was 11, and she was English, and I would have married her like that day for the way she said my name. She said, "Peter, are you looking for something to read?" And I was like, "Uh-huh." Thud, thud. And like any great librarian or great bookseller or teacher or parent who's followed you reading for years, she knew what I was ready for. And she took me over to the fiction shelf and she pulled down a slim little volume of stories called In Our Time by Ernest Hemingway. And you have to imagine like a little kid in New York City bringing that home, a kid who didn't want to be in the city at all. I had cousins in Vermont, and I went up there often, and I just wanted to be part of their family. And so I took that home. I opened it. I started reading, and my heart just about leapt out of my chest. I thought, I want to do that. I want to hop off a slow-moving freight train in Upper Michigan and the peninsula and have a rucksack and climb up through an old burn where the grass is wetting my pant legs with dew and make camp by the Big Two-Hearted River and make a fire and make coffee and not burn my tongue on the cup the way Nick didn't burn his tongue. I didn't know at 11 that he was traumatized by the war. I just thought it was all cool. And I wanted to fish for those gorgeous trout. But mostly what I wanted to do is write like this guy, not like him, but with that power. It was the first time I'd experienced prose that went through my skin straight to my heart and kind of bypassed my head. And you guys know that feeling, right? When you read prose that does that, it's really powerful. And I thought, I want to do that. And so I did everything I could think of to be a great writer. I'd heard that uh, who was it? I'm trying to think. I'll think of it in a second. One of my great idols used to put cards on the wall with words he didn't know, and I thought, I want to do that. It might have been Joseph Conrad. I did that. I jotted down words from the dictionary that I thought sounded cool, that had a certain texture, and then I would try and use them. I copied out poems and paragraphs from stories just to feel the cadence go through my hand. And then, it was time after high school. I went to college and I became an English major. I took a lot of biology because I thought it'd be important to know the difference between a spruce and a pine if I was going to write about nature. And so, I learned the birds and the plants. And I got out of college and I had to make a living. And a friend of mine was living in Boulder, Colorado. And he was training. He was an Olympic ski jumper. He was training for the Olympics. And he had taught me to kayak. And he said, why don't you come out here? I've got a cheap house, so you know how long ago that was. And I've got a room, and you could, we can split it, and you can write and go kayaking. And I thought that sounded great. So I went out and I spent my days writing poetry. I delivered pizza at night. I was like a world-class pizza deliverer. Stop lights meant nothing to me. If no one was coming, why would you stop? And I would go skiing on Mondays because a friend of mine was a ski instructor up at Breckenridge, and he had a free ticket for me on Monday. So that's when, and I remember one evening, we were driving back from skiing to his cabin, and he said, why don't you combine your interests? You're writing in your room all day and you're kayaking this crazy stuff. Why don't you write for Outside Magazine? And I was like, oh, all right. When you're young and dumb, you don't know what you can't do. Thank goodness. And so I went to the magazine store. I pulled off an copy of Outside. I looked on the masthead where all the publishers and editors were, and I looked for the name of a senior editor that sounded nice. And it was Laura Honhold. That's the name I picked. Sounds nice, right? Laura Honhold. 3 H's in the last name. I still don't know quite where to put them all. And I called the 800 number in Chicago, which I looked up, and the receptionist answered and said, Outside Magazine. And I said, Laura Honhold, please. And she said, just a minute. And I was like, crap. And then she said, Laura here. And I started talking as fast as I could. And I said, hey, I just had a short story published in Harper's, which was sort of true. It was just little tiny reprint of a college story. That's what they have in the reading section. It was almost in the margin. I mean, it was so small. And I said, I can kayak class 5, and I think you should send me to the Tibetan Plateau to run this river that's never been done. And this is the sound. And then she said, what issue of Harper's was that? And I said, August. And she said, I'm going to take a chance on you. We've heard about this expedition. We don't have a writer that can kayak class 5, and I'm going to pay half your expenses. And if you write a good story, I'll pay the other half, and I'll buy the story. How's that sound? I was like, yeah, that's pretty good. It's like, yay! It's like dancing around. And so I thought, I can buy a new paddle tomorrow. Mine was all duct taped up. And I went. It was all professional river runners. 3 of us were kayaks, and kayaks are sort of safety boats. We were in far western Sichuan, up against Tibet, up against the Himalayas, and in a little village. And we thought we'd do a training run just to shake down gear and everything. And so there was a little river running along the road, and it was like class 4, just had a nice rhythm and perfect along the road. And so we were getting ready to put in, and we could see a big storm up in the Himalayas, up in the mountains. And the river began to rise and it began to rain. And by the time we put on the river, it was really raucous. It was probably class 5 by then. And I remember I was surfing a wave, sort of warming up, and I peeled off it and I came around the corner, and there was one of the rafts just doing cartwheels in a hydraulic, empty. And that's not what you want to see when you're a kayaker. And so I sprinted ahead and I saw a helmet in the middle of the river, and I paddled for it, and I pivoted my stern around and said, grab the loop. And we hit a breaking wave and got separated, and the whole river was going into the left bank. It was a right bend, and there was a log jam there. It was moving fast into the log jam, and I could see that there was a helmet stuck there already, because that's where the river was going. And we were going there. And somehow I hit a little tiny eddy along the shore, and I grabbed the rocks and I crawled out, and I ran out on the logs, and the guy that I missed went right into the log jam, helmet against the helmet of the first guy. So I ran out. The other kayaker was right behind me. Pulled that guy that I'd missed off and got him to the bank, and he was still alive. He's one of the Chinese guides. And we went back for the second guy, and we started pulling, and he was stuck. We couldn't budge him, and the river was rising, and so we put a Z-drag on him, which is a rope and carabiner system. It's very powerful pulley system, and we couldn't budge him. And so I held his head out of the water, and the river rose over his head, and he died in my arms. And he was on his honeymoon. I had to paddle across the river and tell his new bride that her husband was gone. And she took his ashes the next day. They cremated him right away in the village. And the day after that, we all went down to the river, which was now back low again, that pretty river we'd seen in the beginning. And we sang Amazing Grace, which is sort of what you do when you don't know what else to do. And I had a book of Chinese poetry that I brought with me, a book of Tang Dai. So I thought, to get the heart of the place on my first assignment, I'd bring a book of poems. And I read one. It was by Li Shangyin. It was written in the 9th century. And then we kind of broke up, and the Chinese revoked our permit. We went up onto the Tibetan grasslands into a place that no Westerner had been since 1959. It had been closed. And it was like the Great Plains in 1870. There were these tribes up there that were herding yak on horseback and taking their yurts on travois, long poles. And they had long coats with daggers belted in and snow leopard trim. They often had ceremonial spears in their stirrups. And it was surreal, and we were all grieving. And I came back home after 2 weeks, and I called Laura and I said, I can't write your story. And she said, what happened? And I just unloaded. I know I was traumatized. And she said, you go write that. And I did, and that was their submission for the National Magazine Award that year. And it was a weird way to start in journalism. I knew that if I didn't take another assignment right away, on an expedition, that I probably never kayak again. It's sort of like get back in the saddle. And so I got an assignment from Playboy magazine, which you think of as sort of like an indoor magazine. I don't think Hugh Hefner ever got out of his bathrobe. But at the time, they were publishing a lot of great writers, and I felt, honored to be in the, get an assignment. And it was a Kiwi-Russian expedition to the High Pamirs to run in Tajikistan at the very end of the Soviet Union, 1989, to run what was deemed by the Russians to be the Everest of rivers in the Soviet Union. The last team that had tried it had lost 5 of their 11 guys. And this Kiwi kid, 26-year-old Roy Bailey, and I were the 2 kayakers. We're the ones that are supposed to go out in front and tell the rest of the rafts to Eddie out if, something looked bad. The river came out of a hole in the ground, a big boil, beneath the Furchinko Glacier, which was really weird because you put on it and you went like this around into the canyon. There was a dead snow leopard in the camp. There were wolf tracks in the sand. It felt like the Lord of the Rings to me. It was just wild. And the water was, raucous. And so Roy and I would tell everyone to eddy out. And then the Russians would come to the edge of the canyon. They'd look down and they'd squat and they'd get really grim and they'd start chain smoking. And the Kiwis would bounce around. They go like, "Oh, she'll be right. No worries. I see a line." And it was like this clash of cultures. And the guy that had to navigate between these two teams, the translator, was named Vanya, and he learned all his English from Frank Zappa records. And he could sing every song. And, "Don't eat the yellow snow," all that. And one night he pulled me aside in camp and he said, "Pete, last year I was guiding geology expedition in same area, Pamirs, and in next drainage over was international team of scientists looking for Yeti, led by French guy. So, Pete, I took Swiss Army saw, I took spare deck, plywood deck from raft, I cut foot, and I put handle on foot, screw, and then, like Rock Creek and Rock Moraine there and Snowbank, I went along, I make tracks." He said, next day, Pete, they discovered the tracks, made international headlines, which is true. He said, only one problem, Pete, was all left feet. So clearly not peer reviewed, but it was the perfect antidote for the last trip, and it sort of got me going. And I spent years writing adventure stories, and then as I traveled the world, it became very apparent to me that the planet was having a little bit of a rough time. The ecosphere seemed to be unraveling, and I wrote more and more environmental stories. I wrote about the Cove, the dolphin killing in the Cove. I went with Sea Shepherd to Antarctica to ram the Japanese whaling fleet. I wrote about that, all that. And then I had followed an editor through all these magazines to Business Week. He called me up. His name's Brad Wieners, and he was editor-in-chief of Business Week. And he called up and he said, "Hey, Pete, you want to write for Business Week?" And I was like, "No." And he was like, "Why not?" And I said, "Because it's Business Week, dude." And he said, "Well, look, you can write about anything you want. Just put a pie graph in there." And it's amazing what you can put a pie graph in, like pretty much anything. Dollars and cents are everywhere. And so I had a blast. I wrote for him for like a year, and he was paying more than anybody had ever paid me. And at the end of the year, I thought, I think I have 9 months where I don't have to take a story. It's time. I want to write the novel I wanted to write since I was 11. So I went to the coffee shop and I thought, I don't want to plot. I don't want to plan or make an outline. Because first of all, I came up as a poet, and I'm much more interested in the sound of the language than what happens in the story. And secondly, I thought, this should be like a river expedition. I mean, we should, launch our little boat of a novel onto a narrative current and follow it into new territory, and come around a tight bend, and maybe there's like a cougar drinking, or a flight of swallows, or a waterfall. I wanted to have as much fun as the reader, but I didn't know if anybody did that. I didn't even know if it was like legal, like would the fiction police like knock down the door and say, "You can't do that." I had no idea. So my best friend in high school was Carlton Cuse. When we were 15, we met, and he was the showrunner for Lost and a bunch of other big shows. Like I can't even remember them all now, but I think he's got a couple on right now. He's a huge Hollywood guy. Didn't seem that smart in high school, but he really was. He's just quiet. And I called him up and I said, "Carl Tony, do you know, you work with all these novelists. Do you know anyone who just starts with the first line and lets it rip?" And he said, "Oh yeah, man, I work with Stephen King. He often starts with the first line, has no clue. And it's a voice, and the voice is a character, and the character's in a place. And there's a situation, because there's always a situation. And he writes into the story." And then he said something that really surprised me. He said, "I work with Elmore Leonard." You know, those tightly plotted, like Get Shorty, you know, you've probably seen the movie if you hadn't read the book, but I mean, they seem so tightly plotted and fast paced. And, you know, he starts with the first line, it's probably some guy in a bar in South Florida because it's Elmore Leonard. But it sort of gave me permission. And I went to the coffee shop again. I wrote, I keep the beast running. I keep the 100 low lead on tap. I foresee attacks. Few lines later, my name is Hig, one name, Big Hig if you need another. If I ever woke up crying in the middle of a dream, and I'm not saying I did, it's because the trout are gone, every one. And I just kind of sat up and I said to myself, I'm listening, speak. And then it was as if this guy was on the other side of a campfire on an October night with the wind blowing the flames around. And he was telling me what had happened to him a few years before. And I would go in every day and I would sit down and I would just say to myself, don't think, just listen. And I would like start crying in the middle of the coffee. I'd have tears dripping. Something would happen. I'd have tears dripping on the table. I know people in there were thinking that poor son of a bitch is going through a bad divorce, or, you know, he lost his dog or something. But really what was going on was I was more thrilled than I'd ever been in my life. And I wrote the book in 7 months, and I got to the last page, and the last line of the book is, and my favorite poem is written by Li Shang Yin in the 9th century. It was the poem I had read by the river to Dave, the guy who had died 27 years before. I didn't even know that I knew it, that I remembered it. It just came fully born out of the dark. And it goes, when will I be home? I don't know. In the mountains, in the rainy night, the autumn lake is flooded. One day, we will be back together again. We will sit in the candlelight by the west window, and I will tell you how I remembered you tonight on the stormy mountain. And then I typed the end. And that's sort of the magic of fiction, you know, for me, is that when I'm writing it and I'm in flow, I often end up writing stuff that I didn't know that I knew, and sometimes even stuff that I didn't know. I think I don't, you know, I can't know, which is crazy. It's sort of magical. When I wrote Celine, a couple of novels after The Dog Stars, it was about a young woman who was looking for her father, who had supposedly died in Yellowstone or at the edge of Yellowstone by a bear attack, but she thought maybe he's still alive. She contacted a private eye. That private eye happened to be my mom, this elegant little woman who could shoot and drive and was a crack investigator. And she had died 9 months before. And I realized that I missed her so terribly that I wanted to hang out with her for another year. And so I wrote Celine. As I wrote it, I learned so much about my mom, which is so crazy, right? I mean, I discovered stuff about her. So so fiction is an odd duck, and it's cool, and I just, you know, I love it. Once you start making stuff up, it's hard to go back. Kind of what you want to do as a journalist anyway, half the time. So I thought I might take a few questions. Uh, this is the funnest part, and you know what? You don't. I don't think you need to go to a mic. You could just shout it out. You don't need to stand up. Yeah.
If you look at just natural ability to look for like versus like performance training and like basic stuff versus just years of experience with pen and paper, fingers to a keyboard, or your background as a poet. You know, what creates the ability to write lyrical prose like that just really creates emotion.
Did you guys all hear that? No, in the back. He asked sort of what gave me the ability to write lyrical prose like the prologue? The formal training, the years of practice, the reading, all. Um, so I guess I would say, sort of all of that. But what I want to say about that is that I never want to say like I get in a fugue state and I'm channeling or anything like that. Because if I say that, then people who are writing, practicing, trying to learn the craft of writing, all of a sudden feel like, oh, this is magic. It's sort of like, after I read A River Runs Through It, I wanted it before I read the book. I really wanted to fly fish. After I read the book, I was like, heck with that, man. It's like this art. You got to have a dad who's a Presbyterian minister who wears a white glove teach you, and you got to like be so in tune with. I was like, I can't do all that. So I didn't fly fish for like 20 years until the guy in Paonia, who became one of my best friends, he ran the gas station in this little town, Paonia, Colorado. He saw the rod in the back of my truck. He said, "Where are you going?" I said, I don't know. I've never done it before. I just thought I'd go down to that gold medal water on the Gunnison." He goes, "Nah, man, that's going to be full of," I won't say what he said, from Aspen. "Go upstream." And I said, "Yeah, but I don't know how to do it." He said, "A trout has a brain the size of a pea. Just throw the fly out there. You'll catch a fish." And it's sort of the way I don't want kids to feel that way about writing, like it's this magical thing. And so the way I compare it is like, if you watch, say, an NBA game and you watch, one of the greats drive down the court, and he throwing a pass, taking a pass, doing this layup, and it's all so smooth and fluid, and you could, the guy's not thinking about anything. It's awe-inspiring, and the guy's in flow. And the reason he can do that without thought is because he's done 10,000 layup drills, 10,000 passing drills, and that's what I tell kids and stuff. It's like, I wrote, years and years and years in a room just trying to figure out where to break up the lines in a poem, or how the sound, or what that did to the images, and, how to create characters that jumped off the page. And I threw out so much stuff. I had a girlfriend once years ago who gave me a trash can for my birthday. And it was like the best present I ever got. It was one of those really shiny galvanized trash cans. And it was back when we used typewriters. And I just, she said, just fill it up. And I did. And so I think it's just, the other metaphor I'd like to use is uh, what I read a lot of Louis L'Amour. You guys know who that is? When I was coming up, like back east in New York City and with my cousins in Vermont, I'd be reading these Louis L'Amour books, these cowboy books. I'd never been west of Pennsylvania, but I was like dreaming of mesas and aspen and, elk in the high meadows. And I saw this cover, I think it was Hondo or something, of this guy splashing across a creek leading a pack horse, and there was snow on the rocks, and he looked desperate. His kerchief was blowing in the wind. He had his 6 gun. He was looking behind him. And I thought, I want to do that. And when I got to Paonia, Colorado, where I lived for 10 years, I bought a horse and borrowed a pack horse, and I rode to Wyoming, and it took like a month. And the horse I rode, and I had to have my neighbor like show me how to put on a bridle and tie a hitch for the packs and stuff. But you're walking. I mean, it's not too hard. And I had this horse named Dandy who was 20 years old, and he was an outfitting horse, and he'd spent his life hunting, and he knew these mountains way better than I did. And so I would just give him his head. And that's sort of like the writing. When I go, I just give the horse its head, just let it go. But Dandy has a brain the size of a walnut or whatever. How big is a horse's brain? It's like that, right? So for some reason, he'd want to go down in a gully sometimes, reasons only known to him. And I would just take the reins again and knee him over and say, "Hey, let's go this way." And that's sort of for me how the writing goes. And I think, you're just like, I'm listening to the music and the language. I start with the first line, whose music I love, and follow it into the second. It's all about the sound. And I just, let Dandy run and just have faith that it's going to take me where I want to go. And usually within a few pages, I bump into whatever's really concerning me, like when I wrote about my mom. So that was the short answer. Um, yeah. And if we want to talk about authorial control, that control of taking the reins, I have an awesome story about that, which I'll tell you if someone asks about it. Oh, about authorial control. So, okay, I wrote the Dog Stars. I finished it, and I thought it was sort of like the seventh day. I thought this is pretty good. I really loved it. And I thought if anyone else kind of likes it, maybe it'll, I mean, if it creates any kind of clamor at all, I didn't want to get second novel syndrome, like the sophomore effort thing where you so much pressure for the next one. So I thought I better start the next one right now. As soon as I wrote the end on the Dog Stars, I kind of like a week later, I was like, I better get started because it was 9 months until it was going to get published. So I started the Painter. Okay, so in the Painter, this doesn't ruin it if you haven't read it because it's right in the beginning. My hero is an expressionist painter from Taos. He's up in Colorado trying to get his life together. He goes fishing. He sees a guy beating a horse like to death, and he ends up saving the horse, and eventually he kills the guy with a rock. And I thought, should the guy have a brother bent on vengeance? And I called my editor in New York, Jenny Jackson. I said, should he have a brother? And she said, oh, yeah, of course. So I wrote the brother. And then I was thinking, well, my painter hero who saved the horse has a commission to paint these twins in Santa Fe. When should he go? And when he goes, should the brother like chase him down there and try and kill him? And then I was thinking, I'm thinking about it. This can't be good. I didn't think about the last one much at all. And so I was in Paonia, it's 1,500 people in Western Colorado. And I was in it's where the novel takes place. And I was in the very small, tiny little coffee shop where my hero, Jim, protagonist, meets his model who becomes his lover. And it's such a small shop. There's one little table in the middle, and you're going to talk to anyone who's in there. Well, guess who was in there? Paolo Bacigalupi, the great science fiction writer. This guy's written like blockbusters. He's won Andromeda Awards, Hugo Awards. It's huge. And he lives in town. I kind of waved at him shyly, sometimes, but I never talked to him. So we started talking the way writers do. And I told him about my challenge. And he's a lot younger than me, but he picked up his coffee cup and he said, sit down, son. I want to tell you a story. I wrote 2 short stories. One, Fugue State. That's what he said. I kind of woke up and it was done. I sent it in. It won a big award and I love it. Second story, I plotted every second of the story. I engineered the characters to interact a certain way in every scene. Total authorial control. I sent it in, it won a big award, and I love it. Now, when I hold them both up, I love them both, and I can't tell the difference. And he leaned forward and he said, your job is just to make sure it doesn't suck. And it's like the whole creative burden just lifted off my shoulders. And I thought, oh, yeah, I could probably handle that. But what he was saying that was so marvelous was, look, rely on your craft. You've written 100 stories, if it's slow, tighten it up, take out the bad stuff, rearrange it, just make sure that it's not terrible. The other thing he was saying, which was so wonderful, was every story, every essay every novel can have a different method. Don't sweat it. Sometimes you plot it, sometimes you just let it run, sometimes maybe you pause and block it out ahead, maybe loosely. Don't worry about it. Just write the thing. And it was like the best advice anyone has ever given me as a writer. It was very freeing. So glad you thought of asking that question. We have time for like 2 more. Yes. Yeah. So he said in the dog search, there's no quotation marks. How did that happen? And also, if you notice, there's in all my books, which started with the dog search, there's double spaces between paragraphs and quotes. So, well, two things. One is, Cormac McCarthy had a strong influence on me. I think, I think he's just, a genius. Um, and so I wouldn't be surprised if subconsciously, I might have remembered that as I was writing the Dog Stars. Um, but to tell you the truth, I was so just engaged when I started the Dog Stars. I wasn't really thinking about much, really. And I think it was like this feeling of it's 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 I'm birthing this thing or whatever, and um, I don't have time for convention. But as I wrote it, I realized that it makes a lot of sense in terms of where the context of the book, because everything's been devastated. The entire world has been devastated. The past is rubble. And so, and plus, Hig hasn't talked to anyone in 9 years, and he's totally traumatized, and so his language is broken. And I noticed as I was writing it, as he got more connection with people, and as he warmed up to actually speaking, the language lengthened out and got, it flowed more. Um, so that's sort of how that happened. But there were some influences. I read a book by Coetzee, however you pronounce it, the South African writer, called Into the Heart of the Country. And in that book, it's a novel about a woman in the veld in a cabin on this, open plain that's totally windy, and she's going crazy, and it's her interior monologue, and it's kind of cool. But every paragraph is numbered, and it's just a block of text, and it'll go from her interior monologue to a description, and then and you never know what's coming, and it's sort of mosaic. There are these tiles, and they're all numbered, and what happens is these blocks are like prose poems, and by separating them out with numbers, he somehow the language gets compressed and it becomes more lyrical, and it's more like a prose poem. That really influenced me. So did this book called Far Tortuga by Peter Matheson. Same deal. People are speaking, it's not attributed, there's no quotes, and then there'll be a block of description, then there'll be a poem, and it all just comes at you, and after a while you just relax, and then you can tell who's talking just by the way they speak. And it's really cool that those little tiles somehow distill the language, and I love that. So I just started doing it, and I like it. So you guys have been good. I'm trying to think if there was, yes, third person.
See and describing that, it kind of goes along with where there's a little bit of a separation with the setting, then the characters, how they react or involve with the setting. I'm interested in that. I just read The River, so I can go for different characters from that vantage point of looking from the outward in.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. She asked about, how you, in the Rivers third person, how do you go looking from the outside? And because the Dog Stars is first person, the Painter, which was the next novel, was first person. And then I think I wrote Celine, and that was third person. And Celine's the one about my mom. And the thing about breaking into third person, I felt like it was, I mean, there's a line in The River where uh, Jack and Wynn are talking about literature, and they mentioned that some guys took a big risk with his book. And Jack's like, this is a big risk. Running this rapid would be a big risk. These guys got to get a life. What do you mean a big, a big risk? Um, but I felt like, switching into third person after first person, I thought it's a little scary because there's no place to hide. Like if I'm in first person, I can only be as smart, as erudite, as witty, as all that as my character. Once I'm in third person, it's open field. You guys, here I am, right? So that was a little risky. I mean, it's funny saying that after running those kinds of rivers and stuff, but it feels like that. And I liked it. I liked being able to have that, it opens up more possibilities in terms, of course, of what you can tell. So in the river, it just so happened, and I didn't plan it, like, because as I said, I don't plan the thing. But what I loved about writing the river was that it was third person, but it felt almost like first person, alternate, because the camera. So I had the camera that's showing the story. It was very close to Jack, one of the characters, and then it was very close to Win, and it almost felt as it alternated like first person, and I thought that was very interesting, but it still gave you the freedom to look down like a hawk or a crow, so I don't know how this stuff happens. I really know it's so cool. um, so now we have to go, but I'm gonna read you guys a paragraph. I want to tell you, so Burn is about these two guys. They're best friends since they grew up in southern Vermont, in Putney, Vermont. Kindergarten to high school, they've gone together. They played on the same soccer team, probably fell in love with the same girls, and uh, they've been at each other's houses, hundreds of nights, helped each other get the wood in, stuff like that. They're like brothers. So Jess and Story meet, now they're in their mid 30s. They meet every fall. One lives in Vermont, one lives in Colorado. They meet every fall to go hunting. And now they're in north central Maine. They both pulled moose tags, which is really hard to do. And they're up in that big timber country, which is just like dirt roads and woods and lakes and creeks. And they come to a bridge. They're moving camp, and they come to a bridge that's been blown. And they backtrack and to a village. They need gas, and it's been burned to the ground. And they soon come to realize that Maine has seceded from the Union while they've been out. And this doesn't ruin it. This is all very much in the beginning. So anyway, they're like brothers, and find a page here. So Jess's parents, he lives up the hill, a mile up the hill. His parents are sort of serious, and he's an only child. Story's family, he has two sisters. So there's five of them. They have dogs and horses, and they're really fun, and it's pretty lively down there. So he spends pretty much half his nights down at Story's house, and they even gave him a room in the barn. So that's where this comes from. So let's see. And so the Brants, who were always jostling, jostled enough to squeeze Jess in. Jess could jog down to the ridge in 7 minutes or ride his bike in 3. And by middle school, it was fair to say he spent 2 or 3 nights a week there. And he slept better under the heap of barn-smelling quilts than anywhere else on the planet. Happier. Sometimes at night, looking out the window at the flowing shadow of the tree line under stars blown like grass seed, and listening to the barks of geese drifting down from the high dark, he felt that he might die. Not perish, but simply cease at the apex of his own fullness. There would be a rightness in it. Joy could not be sustained for more than a minute. But what if one was lifted on a wave of happiness, and right on the breaking crest, one's spirit flew off like a wind-torn albatross? What if? As he followed Story up the freshly maintained track that smelled of shorn grass and trimmed saplings, Jess thought, I am already dead. A long time ago, I died of fullness 100 times, and so now I need not be frightened. But I am. Thank you so much for coming. And I'd be glad to sign your books if you'd like.